Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I made Big Bird, but like, as a dinosaur, chasing Elmo. Now, the first step in making a big spooky jaundiced bird is building a body, and for that, I need a block of wood covered in aluminium tape. With that, I'm then ready for my body, which can of course be bent into the correct pose. Finally, I can add the tail and a head. And with that, I've got a quick prehistoric bird skeleton ready for bulking with more aluminium foil. I plan to have Big Bird balanced non-bipedally, so I need to keep the weight to a minimum, which is where the foil fits in. Otherwise, once I've got a fully foiled avian form, I can begin the enclaying process, covering as much of the body as I can with an initial layer of clay, which will give me something slightly firmer to add the detail onto later. I decided to go with the Dromaeosaurus as the base for my Big Bird, so I need the tail to be like one of those big leaves that fancy rich people force poor people to wave them with while they lounge on a sofa eating grapes and drinking wine. So I'll use some aluminium tape to build a relatively stable form that I can add the clay on top of. From here on out, I'll be building Big Bird with colored clay to cut down on the amount of painting I have to do, since yellow is, of course, the worst color to have to paint, but in reality the only thing that isn't yellow are his legs, which are orange, so I've made the upper part of the lower leg in orange clay before getting to work laying a very thin layer of yellow clay over all of the recently baked gray clay. With that initial yellow layer in place, I can start to add slightly thicker lumps to refine the shape of the body, as well as give me something to add that feathery texture on top of. Otherwise, I'll give the whole body a smoothing to remove any outstanding sharp edges or lumpy bits, and it's on to adding all my texture. Now, when it comes to adding texture, there are 3 rules that I adhere to. 1, it needs to look good. 2, it needs to be fast. And 3, you could ignore rule 1 if rule 2 fits. To that end, I tested a few texture making methods using a variety of tools and ended up with my soft silicone brush being the best looking option while still working nice and fast. I'm sure the cynical among you will think obviously he already knew that if he didn't test any other methods after the silicone brush, but you forgot about rule number 4. If it works well enough, don't bother trying to find something better. I can then apply this freshly tested feather making method to Big Bird's expansive yellow body. Finally, to add a little extra feathering and give the feathers the illusion of being 3-dimensional, I'll stick some slightly raised feathers strategically placed over top the otherwise rather flat feathers. Then it's back to the rest of the body, building up the initial flat feather texture followed by extra feathers on top until I've got a fully feathered yellow leadbetter ready for a final feather texturing by way of a heavy dousing in isopropyl alcohol followed by a soft nylon brushing in the direction of the feathers to impart some final feathery texture. For the tail feathers, I'll add some little wormy dealies looped from the top side to the underside and pulled back to create a sorta feathery looking thing that I can then refine the shape of before carving some more feathers on top to create a layered appearance and finishing it all off with another quick nylon brush. With that, my tail feathers are finished and I can move all the way to the front to make the beak by jamming some armature wire into the middle of the big yellow ball and adding some tapered sausages that I can then shape into beak-shaped shapes. Once I've got a pair of perfectly pointed, precariously positioned bird biters, I can poke some sniffers into the front of them, then add a long tongue into the mouth and poke a couple oversized eye sockets to get a pair of undersized eyes inside. Otherwise, with the eyes in place, I could begin the cranial infeathering, which will take a slightly different approach from the rest of the body. Since the eye will always be drawn to the head, it behooves me to take a bit of extra time to add each individual feather rather than use the silicone shaper to add the fake feathers. Also, for what it's worth, adding these feathers took just as long as adding all the other feathers, which means that this method fails rule number 2, which is why I didn't do it for the rest of the body. Finally, I'll fit a few extra long antennae feathers on top before baking the body and drilling a couple holes so I can add Big Bird's wings. Because Big Bird is going to be sprinting after Elmo, I'll make sure to position the arms in an appropriately speedy position, adding the clay around the shoulders before using more of the aluminium tape to thicken up the forearm where the feathery bits will be. Then once I've marked out each individual feather, I can refine the shape and clean up the edges until I've got a nice feathered wing, at which point I'll add the larger feather texture, followed by a smaller feathery upper arm texture, and a final little feathery top coat on the front of the wing. With that, it's back into the oven to bake one more time before testing to see if this single armature wire in Big Bird's back leg can support the weight of his entire body.
Wow.
Now that I know it can, I can safely snip away the excess support from the other leg and begin building up Big Bird's Big Bird feet. These start as little orange lumps that I can pinch and pull into a triplet of toes with an oversized center toe that I can then attach to the as yet unclayed armature wire extending into the wooden block. I'll clean up the back of the foot and add some extra lumpy lumps to make it look kind of like a chicken leg before using a little lumpy roller to add little lumpy texture. Some smooshed worms of clay layered on top will slowly become the layered scales of the foot as I work the texture into the top, and then I can poke some big divots into the tips of the toes to add talons, turning these toes into claws. I'll then repeat this process once more for the other foot that is now upraised and pointed backwards as Big Bird sprints forward at full speed, and that's my big yellow terror bird all but finished, which means it's time to make his lunch. I'll start by taking a lump of red clay and removing a head-sized lump that I can mount on a little armature spine. I'll then cut away a piece of my spherical pie, creating Elmo's oversized, extra screamy mouth before adding the fur around the face and the back of the head. Then I'll stick a little orange nose in place, followed by a couple big round eyeballs, and I can start to build up Elmo's body, which is mostly just a pear-shaped lump of red clay into which I can add some arms. Elmo's arms start as little red sausages that get the tips snipped into a quartet of tiny red fingers that I'll pinch and poke until they're just fingery enough before bending the arm at an angle and cutting it open so I can fit a length of armature wire inside. I'll then attach the arm to the body and build a second arm before working my way from the fingertips down to the bottom of the body, adding more furry texture. I'll then remove Elmo from the block and cut away the excess armature wire and drill a couple holes to fit some pre-bent Elmo legs that I'll cover in another layer of red clay, textured in that same furry finish. With that, Elmo is done and ready for a coat of paint. Obviously, I chose clay that's already Elmo ready, but it's a bit flat, so I'll add some shading by giving his whole body a red wash, which will settle into all that furry texture. Then once that's had a chance to dry, I'll aggressively dry brush his whole body with several coats of progressively lighter reds to bring back the vibrancy and add some highlights on the fur. I'll then paint the inside of his mouth pitch black and give his nose a little orange followed by orange, while his eyes can get a once-over with white to clean up any overbrushing, and a couple little black pupils will finish him off. Then it's on to Big Bird, who kinda gets the exact same treatment, with that one-tone yellow texture getting a full once-over with a dark yellowy orangey wash to really sink into the feather textures and give me some recessed shading, followed by several progressively brighter yellow dry brushes over top to bring that vibrant yellow color back to the tips. I'll then brush his orange legs with an orangey dry brush to highlight the leg bumps as well as give the scales a bit of attention before washing it with a brown wash to tone down the colors just a bit. I'll then tickle the tips of his talons with a black base coat followed by some gray highlights, and it's on to the beak where I'll paint the inside of the mouth colors before moving up to his eyes. Big Bird's eyes have a pink to blue coloring that I wanted to capture on my Dromaeosaurus rendition, but I didn't know how to get that around the eyes themselves, so instead I painted the feathers above his eyes pink and blue. I then painted the eyes with a black to set the shading inside that I then followed with a white base coat before adding a messy orange dinosaur iris, followed by a black slit down the middle. Last but not least, I'll goop the eyeballs up by giving them a coating of high gloss varnish, and that's my big spooky yellow bird and his soon-to-be lunch finished and ready for a base. Now, in keeping with my Dromaeosaurus theme, I decided to go with a sandy, rocky base, which means I'm going to need to make some rocks. Once I've got some fine little foam rocks, I can attach them to a piece of MDF and add that final bit of rocky texture the only way I know how: by smashing them with actual rocks. Before I add any sand, I want to give the ground a bit of natural undulation, so I'm going to mix up some plaster. I'll fill my little mixing bucket with some Sculptamold, then add a carefully measured amount of dirty brush rinsing water and mix it into a delicious sounding porridge that I can then spread all over my base. I'll continue to work it while it sets until I've got a nice smooth, somewhat wavy, slightly textured form that I can set aside to dry. Before I do that though, I'll paint each of the rocks with a gesso to prime them white so I can paint them later. And once the base has had a chance to dry properly, I can mix up some simple desert rock colored washes using black, brown, and yellow inks. I'll brush the rocks with some water to help the inks flow, then I can start to dab the trio of inks haphazardly around the rocks, letting the colors mix and blend as they see fit. Once I've got all the rocks covered and colored, I can use my brush to soak up any of the pooled inks, then set it aside to dry so that I can finally add my sandy top coat. I'll start by laying down an extra thick, extra gooey layer of basing glue everywhere that I want the sand to stick, then using a sieve I can pour my sand-colored grout directly onto the glue, brushing any of the extra grout off my rocks. I'll then add a couple footprints to show Elmo's terrified passage through the sand before locking all the grout in place with a heavy misting of alcohol and some watered-down PVA glue. I can then take a minute to paint the base black before drilling a couple holes that I'll fill with glue so that I can fit Big Bird and Elmo into their respective positions. Finally, to finish it all off, I'll add a few little tufts of desert grass and, well, that's us done here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, Kathleen, Sin, Corey and Haley, Tron Cat, and Benoit Big Beans. You are the big orange feet that carry this oversized velocibird of a channel toward its unwitting furry red lunch. As always, if you like this video, then do the thing and the other thing and share the thing and all the other things. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.